Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 27th of July. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, is the Labour Party a friend of business? The donations are flooding in from different parts of the party, including the Blairite wing. Can Keir Starmer maintain this while keeping the unions and the left of his party happy? I'll be speaking to Katy Balls and former Labour advisor John McTernan. Could Ukraine win the war using drones? The Spectator's Svitlana Morenets is in Kyiv meeting some of the soldiers who are training to fly drones and drop bombs. She joins me on the show. Since the Iraq War, many people have debated whether it was a mistake for the West to invade. But is it so simple to say yes or no? We'll hear from Douglas Murray. Labour has announced plans to change the gender recognition legislation. Nicola Sturgeon, in part, had to resign over her proposals on women-only spaces. Can the Labour Party get it right? We'll be speaking to the Telegraph's writer Suzanne Moore. And finally, our wiki man Rory Sutherland is with us for his latest trick to boost your property price. Stay tuned. Before we get going, why not subscribe to The Spectator? If you subscribe today, you'll not only get your first month free, but after your trial, you'll pay just £1 a week for full access to our website and app, or £2 a week if you want the print magazine too. To claim this offer, go to spectator.co.uk/best. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Spectator TV is picking up thousands of new subscribers every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Now first up, for the cover piece this week, our political editor Katy Balls has been looking into Labour's donors. Under Keir Starmer, more money was given to the Labour Party by private donors and businesses last year than by the unions. Has his strategy been part of a wider plan to rebuild relations with the corporate world? Katy and John McTernan, a former Labour advisor, join me on the show. Katy and John, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Now, Katy, before we dive into your cover piece for the magazine this week, I wanted to ask you about the ongoing NatWest Coutts scandal. We have now seen their chief exec, Dame Alison Rose, resign, and that was a very fast U-turn after just hours previous, the board suggesting that they had complete faith in her. Is this the end of the saga, or does it rumble on?
So I don't think it's the end for two reasons. First, the wider issue, which has been also being debanked, is still live. Nigel Farage is not the first figure to find that he no longer has a bank account. It's been cancelled by one of the main lenders. And therefore you have this week the ministers, Andrew Griffith, the city minister, meeting with the big banks, a meeting Alison Rose was supposed to be at, but is not because she's no longer in a role, to look at the steps you can take to protect consumers from effectively being barred because of their political beliefs and other things. So that will keep going. And then I think when it comes to NatWest specifically and the Coutts Nigel Farage row, you see that Nigel Farage is now talking about how the whole NatWest board, in his opinion, needs to go, points to the fact that throughout this, one of the reasons Alison Rose has seemed confident until obviously very early morning is effectively that the board were behind her. And therefore, what does that say about the judgment of the board? So you can see that's where the story is starting to go. And then I think politically is interesting, speaking to figures in government, they were astonished when Alison Rose effectively admitted that she had been the source to the BBC journalist, which ultimately ran a story that was not accurate about Nigel Farage's bank accounts, that despite that she thought she could stay on. But now there seems to be a little bit of a dividing line between the Tories and Labour, with one Labour frontbencher effectively saying it's not for the government to intervene and leave it to NatWest, which I think does actually link to the cover piece we're about to speak about, because it's part of this wider, I think, position of Labour of being pro-business and trying to not be scary to business, be the friends of business when they can.
And we have seen the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, come out and now suggest that it was right that Alison Rose stepped down. But as you say, Katy, there's this growing divide between the trade unions and the grassroots members pushing for radicalism, and Keir Starmer more generally who's pushing for moderation. And your cover piece looks at who's tipped to win.
Yeah, so effectively, something we talked about previously is, which are the unions which are the most influential on Keir Starmer. Now, the three big affiliated unions, effectively, he does have the support of two, Unison and GMB. It's Unite, which used to be very pro-Corbyn, which is the most hostile. But this came to a head again last weekend at the National Policy Forum, where you had the grassroots, Unite, and other union leaders raising some concerns and pushing for things on workers' rights, the grassroots, for example, raising issues on free school meals, ultimately wanting the Labour leader to be more radical. Now, Keir Starmer, as tends to be the case these days, won the battle. The draft policy document, which is the beginning of thrashing out the Labour manifesto, went as the Labour leadership wanted. And the reason that he can live with having Unite the Union come out and say, we're not backing that document in full, and also the Momentum, the grassroots group, say Britain deserves better, is not just because he has votes elsewhere, it's because of the funding and the financial model on which the Labour Party now sits. When Keir Starmer took over the Labour Party, he inherited plenty of legal cases and fees from the Corbyn era, a Labour Live, the music festival that wasn't particularly successful, loss-making by quite a high number, and ultimately a cash-strapped party. Now, Jeremy Corbyn funded Labour by largely going on membership, which he increased significantly, over 100,000 left when Keir Starmer took over, and also the unions. Ed Miliband had a bit more in private donations, but still his largest donors were the unions. And what we've seen Keir Starmer do, and I think is a purposeful calculation by he and his team, is if you are going to take the route which they believe is the path to power of moving rightwards in many ways, that's not going to be something which you can do, I think, unless you have other forms of funding as well. And therefore, they've gone back to the Blairite model, which does involve finding ultimately Labour-leaning or at least centrist millionaires to help fund you.
John, what are the risks to Starmer upsetting the unions and the radical left of his party?
So look, the unions, I think we've discussed this before, me and Katie, the unions have decided that they want a Labour government. That doesn't guarantee a Labour government, but it's the beginning of working together. And going into the National Policy Forum, I know that Keir's office were very confident that they knew that they could do a deal. And the thing is, with the Labour movement, with the union movement, there's always a deal to be done. And you have to cut through the noise from their conferences and their national executive committees and their delegates and just go, what does the union leader want? What does Sharon want from Unite? What does Christina want from Unison? What does Gary want from the GMB? Ask the question, do the deal, and all the rest is just kind of scaffolding to get there. So I think the unions have decided that they want the unity required to get to a Labour government, to show that they're together. And I think one thing, Katie touched on it, Labour are much more pro-business, explicitly, vocally. Labour, and you saw that from the front bench's comment, Labour would be very, very doubtful about saying what a private company should be doing. It's for companies and the markets sort out who should do what in the banking sector. It's not for government ministers. And I've heard very senior business leaders over the last 6 months say to me, the problem with the Tory government is they're very socialistic. Like the New Year speech that Keir made in East London when he talked about Labour's approach to business and markets, lots of business people who were there said to me, do you know what? That sounds like the kind of government I would want to be working with. And I think the repositioning, both with the unions and with business, has been a really concerted strategy. And the fact that, what was the weekend National Policy Forum? What was it really the story? It was the dog that didn't bark. There was no revolt. There was no major overturning, no major confrontation. And look, I think normal people kind of side with Nigel Farage. You shouldn't not have a bank account because of your political views. I think he was a victim. He portrayed himself as a victim, but he actually was a victim. And like as a PR professional, I think NatWest moved too slowly. You have one chance to explain yourself. You explain yourself fully and publicly. You don't brief a story that changes and then have a public story that changes and another story that changes. If you're in a sticky situation, stop, tell the truth. The truth doesn't set you free, but changing your story condemns you. And we see that today with Alison Rose resigning in the early hours of the morning. And of course, don't take on the government while they're a big shareholder, probably the biggest single shareholder in NatWest at the moment still.
John, of course, NatWest is a unique example because the taxpayer has a stake in NatWest, a 40% stake. So it was basically a guarantee that politicians would have to comment on that. But it is more broadly clear that Labour are finally pulling together after years of infighting, the MPs, the unions, to come together around a more pro-business agenda. But can that glue really bind them together and keep them together going into a general election?
Look, that's a great question. And the thing which has always been the base, the fundamental base of the Labour Party, because one union that Katy didn't mention in the list of unions is, the biggest union, Unite, second biggest union, Unison, third biggest, GMB, fourth biggest, Usdaw, the shop workers union. The biggest strength of the Labour Party in rooting it in reality is the workers who work in the private sector, shop workers, in the GMB's case, defence workers, gas workers, energy workers. And that grounding, 86% of people in Britain work in the private sector, only 14% work in the public sector. Almost all discourse about work and employment is as if we all work for the government. We don't. Mm-hmm. A danger, a cul-de-sac for the Tories is that they've got to current government is that they focus on that. The Labour Party and the unions know a growing economy is what keeps union members prosperous. In the end, that's what dragged Labour back to where it is. After Miliband, after Corbyn's leadership, Labour are back wanting to have a growing economy, and the unions accept that they can't grow without a growing economy. So look, I think it's the fundamentals, the reality, the gravity, I suppose, the gravity of the political economy is dragging Labour back to a place where it and the unions can't pull apart. And you look at the other side, look at the Conservative Party. There's no force that makes them want to work together, even though they're in government. And yet, being in government and wanting to be re-elected should be the biggest force you have.
Katy, in your cover piece, and as you mentioned at the start of this interview, you talk a bit about the Blair money that is returning, funneling back into the Labour Party. But should voters assume then that we're looking at another Blairite form of government?
So the piece is about how Labour is being funded at the moment, and that is ultimately three different groups, I think, broadly, when you look at the donations coming in. So the unions still have a say, but effectively more is coming from private donors and businesses. And what is that saying about the direction of the Labour Party? As you say, one group tends to be the return of the Blairite donors. So you have Lord Sainsbury's back, his daughter, Fran, is back. She's donated $1 million. She's also helping with the fundraising efforts. And you have quite a lot in terms of Blairite donors returning. They then cross over, I think, to quite a few donors who are not necessarily donors under Blair, but what they have in common is they tend to be quite pro-EU. Quite a lot gave money during the Remain campaigns. And you have some, for example, businessmen saying that their biggest problem with the Tories is Brexit. So one donor who gave the Tories 500,000 and it could go up to 5 million ahead of the election, has said of all the Tory sins, and he wants to make sure the Tories are at power for a long time, effectively Brexit is the worst. So that does raise a question, I think, as to what this group of, you have so many donors who are quite open about being very pro-Remain, what do they want to see from a Labour government? Because Labour's been very clear that they won't rejoin the customs union, the single market, and so forth. But I think you'll start to hear a listen to business if you get a Labour government. And then the other group, which I think is quite interesting, is Tory donors. And there's been a big effort to try to bring Tory donors across to become Labour donors, which merges a bit with the business engagement. So you'll have these business figures be invited to meet with Rachel Reeves and her deputy, Pat McFadden. And then they will effectively ultimately give a spiel, and you're told, well, if you would like to donate to this, let us know. And I think here they're not going for, I suppose, the most dyed-in-the-wool, true blue Tory donors, but instead quite centre-ground Tory donors who they think they can peel back. Because if the party looks as though it's on the cusp of power, that's when I think lots of people say, well, even if I don't agree with everything they're going to do, I like to have a sense that I have some influence or I know who to speak to. And that's why you now see a situation where private donations, I think, are up at the highest level they've been since 2008. And also, for the first time, I think, since records began, more coming from private donors and businesses than are from the trade unions.
John, everybody likes to back a winner, but still, this is a pretty confident move from the Labour Party trying to pull in Tory donors.
Historically, the Labour Party, when it wins because it has the backing of the country. And it is the recent years, the last 10 years, when Labour's been very anti-business, that people look at and they go, this looks different, this looks strange. But from the perspective of the Labour government that used to win elections in 97 and 2001, 2005, it's actually it's the behaviour of the leaders in opposition that's been eccentric and not the one that says we should be backing business. And again, it goes back to my point, which is we're founded by labour unions, we're founded by trade unions. Unions have always understood that they do not thrive, their members don't thrive, the country doesn't thrive, working class people don't thrive unless business thrives. And it's been a strange moment in the wilderness that Labour has had. And so, yes, I admit it does look strange, different from the previous behaviour of the Labour Party, but it's not different from the behaviour of the Harold Wilson government and the Tony Blair government. And I think the key is, I was saying government there, and oppositions can act differently, but when you want to do the right thing for the country, and in the end, there's a consensus, even in a sense, Liz Truss shared it. We need to get the economy growing. She had the wrong views and the wrong policies, and they nearly crashed the economy. And the markets had a message for us on that. But if you want to grow the economy, as the Labour Party, and as I've said this on previous discussions about industrial relations, the Labour Party governs for workers and for business. It governs, for pensioners and for workers. It governs for young people and older people. It governs for the whole country. And so if you're governing for the whole country, it would actually be quite perverse to say, I can't take your money, I can't ask you for your money, I can't discuss with you the kind of policies you think will be right for the country. We're not going to take the policies that you want, but if we listen to you, we may improve the policies we have. So I think it's the Labour Party returning to normal. And it's been on a very, very strange journey, I have to say, and I accept that. But actually, it's the Labour Party being much more normal to its history, because it is a Labour Party, not a socialist party.
Katy, last question to you. And as you note in your piece, Labour is coming to terms with the fact that being in power, getting money, getting votes realistically means making, in the words of Rishi Sunak, tough choices, no lifting the 2-child benefit limit, no free school meals across the board, no radical extension of workers' rights. But as they take the money and as they hope to take the votes, are they at risk of also taking the title of the nasty party?
So I think moving from opposition to power is always going to be a painful process. You had last week when the 2-child benefit row first came into the open, Sir Keir Starmer trending on social media as a nickname for Keir Starmer, because lots of people thought this isn't what a Labour government should be doing. And therefore, I think Rachel Reeves, particularly along with Keir Starmer, are going to face lots of attacks from activists on the left, also some disheartened voters. And that's why those around Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are trying to work out how you can frame the tough decisions in a way where you're blaming it on the Tories and legacy, in the way that you think about the "there's no money left" note was used by the Tories constantly whenever there was a problem to try and trash the legacy of the Labour government. So I think there's things like that going on. And yeah, it's ultimately the decision has been made. You have to be pretty restrained in what you're promising. You can see that from the Labour Policy Forum this weekend. You can see it from the messages to businesses. We talk about, John talks about the party returning to normal. I mean, I think the fact that I write in the piece about some of these business figures who've been invited to these sessions, and Pat McFadden, who is the shadow chief secretary of the Treasury, he has been known to say in these sessions, you can trust me effectively. I'm obviously loosely quoting him, because I was the first minister to be sacked by Jeremy Corbyn. So, and that
point of pride,
and that does calm down the room.
Yeah.
So I think you are seeing something like that as they try and move to this centrist position.
John and Katy, thanks so much for joining me. Next, Ukraine has upped its training to teach soldiers how to drop bombs using drones. Could this tactic win them the war? Spectator writer Svitlana Morenets is currently in Ukraine and has been to see some of the training. She's with me now. Svitlana, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. You are currently in Kyiv, and before we get into your piece for the magazine this week, I was hoping you could give us an update on what's happening.
Hi, Kate. Currently, there is a air raid alert in Kyiv, but the main target for the last few days has been Odessa, and Russia has been shelling the city every night and destroying the ports with grain, the equipment. because as they left the grain deal, now they want the West to give some concessions. So Odessa is targeted all the time right now, and Ukraine doesn't have enough air defenses to protect it. And today Zelensky was talking about that he actually received more of air defense from one country, he didn't name it, and said that we will put it in a place that is the most targeted right now. He didn't name it, but it was obvious that it would be Odessa. About the rest of Ukraine, it's the counteroffensive is going slowly because of the mines.
Well, that brings us on to your magazine piece this week, Svitlana, which looks at drones, which have become the big business in Ukraine, having replaced many key aspects of conventional warfare. And they're crucial right now for tackling the mines that have been laid. Can you talk us through it?
Yes, of course. Ukrainians want to build a significant army of drones. First, because it saves the lives of the soldiers. And second, because they are very effective on the battlefield. Because if you talk about reconnaissance drones, they help to see where's the enemy, where their warehouse is, and they help to direct the artillery where they should strike. So, in also soldiers who work in intelligence and the infantry, they don't need to go forward right now. They first send drones, and then they see where they can go and where they can't. And the strike drones that can carry explosives, they help to destroy as well as Russian military personnel and the weapons that they have. So they are very much needed, and Russia has many more drones than Ukraine. That's why the country has been trying to produce them domestically, because yes, allies help us, but these amounts are not enough big to keep everyday fight. So because of it's a problem for Ukraine that because of the years of the bureaucracy and red tape, we had only 7 companies that were selling drones to the state. And right now, they are trying to reform it, and it has been pretty successful because right now there are 40 companies selling to the state and more than 100 producing drones, but they still haven't received the contract. But even without contract with the Ukraine Defense Ministry, they can sell the drones to anyone, like volunteers. They ask Ukrainians to donate. And when they have enough money, they buy the drones and they give them as gifts to the soldiers.
Well, you have visited a so-called drone school, and I have a lot of questions about this. But the first thing I want to know is, what is the school for?
The school is to teach soldiers to become drone operators, because soldiers who are currently on the front line, they are allowed to choose the profession. Not all of them, but some of them, yes. And if they decide they want to become drone operators, they apply for school, and it is completely for free. Also, it is a private school. There are only private schools of drone operators in Ukraine. But the Ministry of Digital Transformation, they pay for every soldiers who graduates to the school. And I saw when I came there, the soldiers were really excited because there first they learn on simulators, on computers, have to fly for 1 week, and the next week they learn in the big closed building and have to fly the drone already. And on the 3rd week they go to the field and learn have to fly the drone there and have to drop the explosives. Of course, they are fake. But the school also told me they would like the soldiers to work with real explosives before they go to the front line as drone operators, because they must know what is the danger of it and have to work with it correctly. Because anyway, you are more relaxed when you drop a fake bomb, while you are training. But the schools and drone factories are not allowed for now to make the explosives, and the government needs to make reform on it too, to allow them or to make the explosives for the drones, or to assign the instructors or trainers who will come from the military factories that produce the explosives, and they will train them. So that's still a big question.
So how quickly can a complete novice learn the basics of becoming a drone controller and then be out on the front lines, presumably doing so?
It depends, because there are different types of drones. For example, for the reconnaissance, they need like 1 week. But for example, drones with that carry explosives takes 3 weeks. But unfortunately, there are some schools that offer like 3 days training or 1 week training for the strike drones, and it shouldn't be like that, because it's dangerous when the soldier still is not doesn't know so well how to operate the drone, and he goes to the front line and he takes that explosive and he endangers those next to him.
You write in your piece for the magazine that it isn't just people who are going through this drone school who are aiding the military. You met a man who was using his engineering skills and background to make homemade drones, which he then supplies to the military. Not only is that very interesting about, how Ukraine is getting its weaponry, it also suggests that they're really desperate for supply.
Yes, of course. And most of these people who right now make drones, they have engineering background, but they just started it by themselves with their own funds. The government didn't help them. They started they made 1 drone, 5 drones. Then when people started buying them, then they increased the production. But as they often tell, they make the drones on their knees because they don't have the building where to make them, the right equipment, and everything costs money. And also when we talk about the drone components, first, they are very difficult to find, they're expensive, and China tends to sell those components more to Russia than to Ukraine. So sometimes they end up buying Chinese components that were sold to US or other countries and buy them for inflated price. And that's also an issue. But if they receive the contract with the Ministry of Defense, then they can sell much more, because already the government makes requests and they want to buy many more drones than volunteers can afford. And right now, the private companies that produce drones, they need only 6 weeks to receive the contract with the state. Earlier, it was taking years to do so. And right now, they just need to show how the drone works, to show him on the field, the state will evaluate it and evaluate the price. And then all is done and they can supply for the state. Also, the question varies for the state to take the money to buy those drones, because reconnaissance drones cost from 3,000 pounds. If we talk about strike drones, it can be 30,000. So for Ukraine, right now, they buy drones using donations a lot, because Ukraine has the project called United 24, and it was created last year by Zelensky, and it is gathering money for buying more drones for Ukraine.
You write about the advantages of drones, that they are relatively cheap to make. Of course, there's the lower risk to a soldier's life because they're remote controlled. But let's also talk about some of those disadvantages. What have you been finding out?
These disadvantages of drones, that there are so few of them, and there are still not enough drone operators or well-qualified ones, because Ukraine is making amazing drones, different drones. They can go on water, they can fly. They use right now even artificial intelligence, that when Russia tries to down the drone and the GPS doesn't work anymore, so anyway, drone flies to target and hits it. So Ukraine has a lot of nice scientists, engineers who can make those drones. The disadvantage is there is few funding, and a few components for making them in big bunches, to increase the production, because this war is different from the others because it's very technological, and it's like the 30 kilometers between the two armies, they are just full of drones, reconnaissance drones or striking drones, and they have even fights in the sky between the drones. So it's completely different, and Ukraine needs a lot of them because they save the lives. And yes, in my piece I mentioned that approximately 10,000 drones per month Ukraine loses. It is not an official number from the government, but there were some researchers saying that. But it is better to lose drones than soldiers, of course. So Ukraine needs as many as to make them as many as they can. And Fedorov, the minister who is in charge of the army of drones, he told me that right now, in the last 2 months, they signed more contracts with the drone manufacturers in Ukraine than in the last year. So it's getting better.
Svitlana, thanks very much for joining me. Next, Spectator columnist Douglas Murray has written this week about his conflicted thoughts over the Iraq War. Many now see the invasion as a grave mistake, but for others, it's not that straightforward. He joins me now. Douglas, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You have written your column this week on your views about the Iraq War, and I should say conflicting views. You felt around the 20th anniversary back in March that you weren't quite sure what to say about it, but something else has happened recently that has prompted you to write about it this week. Tell us what that is.
Yes, that's the very sad death of the former Labour MP Anne Clwyd. Anne Clwyd left the House of Commons a number of years ago, but she was an extraordinarily long-serving and devoted Labour MP. She was one of, I think it's right to say, one of the sort of slightly awkward squad that all parties have. You don't fit into any particularly clear clique, and therefore don't always rise as high up on the greasy pole as perhaps they should. But Anne Clwyd was a really remarkable woman, and not only represented her constituents with great aplomb, but was also perhaps most famous in recent years for her internationalism. And specifically, and it's what brings me to write about the Second Iraq War, her devotion to the cause of the Kurdish people of northern Iraq. Anne Clwyd traveled to the area after the Anfal campaign in 1988, when Saddam Hussein tried to ethnically cleanse the Kurdish people in the north of his country. And she saw firsthand the brutality of that regime and campaigned for decades, not just for democratic rights in Iraq for all Iraqi people, but specifically also to indict Saddam Hussein for his war crimes against his own people in Iraq. And that didn't have any success, as it were, until 2003, when people listened to the case she made in great silence. I remember in the House of Commons, when in 2003 she explained what the horrors were of the Saddam Hussein regime. And that's what brought me to write about this terrible subject again, which was just that the complexity of it at a time when I think some people from all sides talk about the subject of Iraq, the very painful subject of Iraq, with a sort of degree of simplicity, which I think isn't quite what it warrants.
And Douglas, this hasn't been and still isn't really a left-right political issue, is it? As exemplified by the fact that you and Anne Clwyd had very similar views on the war.
No, that's right. I mean, as it happened, we became friendly and traveled to Iraq together because we shared the same view, which was that the Saddam Hussein regime was guilty of some of the most terrible crimes against its own people and other nations, of course. Remember that Iraq had been involved in a long, bloody war with Iran in the 1980s, it invaded Kuwait, and that it was an incredibly unstable as well as dangerous regime. Anne Clwyd's work included the documenting of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that Saddam Hussein had perpetrated. And many people of left and right felt the same way. some of her obituary notices have noted the fact that she, I think, say erroneously, have said she became friendly with Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld. It's not quite true. She met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz in Washington, certainly, and they and others were interested in this and had been beforehand. Nowadays, there's a sort of again, there's a you say there's a sort of left-right thing that people pretend about this as on all other issues. But there were people from across the political spectrum in those days who were equally concerned about what it meant for the international order to have a regime getting away with crimes of the kind that Saddam Hussein's regime did. And there was a sort of unity in those days. I mentioned in my piece that on one occasion, Ankur and I were visiting a Kurdish rights center in northern Iraq, and I was at least quite amused by the fact that the framed photos going all the way through the hallway and up the stairs were of people like Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, then of the Defense Policy Board, people who back home in America, in Britain, were all viewed with incredible disdain and disgust by that point, but who in this section of Iraq were regarded as heroes because they had argued the case of the Kurdish people, among other things, and their liberation from the tyranny of the Saddam Hussein regime. And as I mentioned, it's just one of those sort of reminders that, history is so much more complex when you're going through it than when you look back with all of the benefits of hindsight.
Douglas, you say in your column that those who opposed the Iraq War 20 years ago are not short of examples of how badly it was botched by countries like the U.S. But you say that your views have never been so black and white, and even to this day, they aren't. And part of that is due to the experiences that you had with Anne in Iraq.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I was very struck that there was an enormous just polarism in those times. When people talk about things being polarized in our politics today, you should remember they were highly polarized 20 years ago as well. But I remember very, very, very struck by the fact that there wasn't very much new you could say about the Iraq War quite early on, even before it began. One of the few things I remember noting somebody saying that I thought was striking was Ian McEwan, the novelist, who at one point, and I can't remember if it's in the novel Saturday or in one of his columns around the same time, but he noted that the anti-war protesters, if they'd have been aware of what they were marching for in totality, should have marched in silence. Now, why did he say that? Because although there was a very good reason to say don't go in at all, it would also, of course, mean the continuation of the Hussein family's tyranny over Iraq, including the inevitable succession of Uday and Qusay Hussein, when their father died. And I was very struck by that observation of McEwan's, and I've always thought at the time it was right. But you hold that view against intervention, but note that also has terrible, terrible consequences, not least for the Iraqi people. And it's just something I sort of say echo in my piece, which is I think everybody who supported the war, there were a lot more back then than perhaps admit it now. Everybody who supported the war has to take some responsibility, or at least culpability, for the terrible things that happened and the disaster of the implementation, the post-war period. And also, and I say it's and as well, recognize that it was not as completely black and white as some people would now paint it in retrospect. I mentioned the piece that on the first years after the Saddam Hussein regime had fallen, and Ankur and I were in the north, and were there when Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year, was being celebrated. This was a festival that had been stamped out throughout the Saddam Hussein years as he tried to rob the Kurdish people of their culture. And here they were able to celebrate it again and be free again for the first time in years. And so rather like that point that McEwan made, I say that I simultaneously can think of the disaster of what happened across most of Iraq and the terrible implementation of post-war planning, and also the fact that in that corner of the country, at least, it is true that a freedom came which had not existed before. And I just sort of think that story can't be lost, and it's one I try to bring out.
Douglas, you had a similar conversation with Peter Hitchens and Fraser Nelson on a very old version of Spectator TV about 8 years ago. And I'm curious to what extent your views have changed since then. I totally take your point that it's never going to be black or white for you, but what do you wish you knew then that you know now?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think that everybody has to take into account the fact that the principal claim of the UK government about WMD turned out to be wrong. And now, again, it's one of those things that people say, well, we knew that to be wrong. But as Bruce Anderson and others have observed in past years, there's no particular shame in taking the word of your intelligence services and government for granted on occasion. And of course, the fact that they were wrong on the WMD claim is one of the things that has caused so much greater skepticism, not just about intelligence claims, but about all claims by politicians in the 20 years since. I think there have been a lot of consequences from that, not least in America with the success of Donald Trump and others who say, you can't trust the institutions. And there's definitely something in that. It's had consequences like that. I think the other thing, and the thing that has been quietly discussed over the last 20 years, and it's probably too early still to discuss among those who were involved, but was exactly where and when the post-war period went so badly wrong. People forget that there was a period of months where Donald Rumsfeld was hailed as a military genius, even by his enemies. I think probably now the history says that he and some others who I knew took their eye off the ball, and I think that was certainly the case. I remember Germaine Greer saying at the time, and I remember I didn't entirely agree with it, but I thought it was very, very interesting point. I remember Germaine Greer saying the problem with war is you open Pandora's box and you just can't contain it. I absolutely see the wisdom of that observation of Germaine Greer's, and certainly I think others who were bullish about interventionism, then having seen what the surgeon was like, have certainly stepped back from supporting it again. In other words, if you can't do it well, don't do it at all. But at the same time, I think that there's an attraction that has come since Iraq to many people on the right and left of a sort of isolationism. And I, at any rate, still certainly don't share that. I don't think it's possible or desirable for a country like America or Britain to simply have a domestic policy and not have a foreign policy as well. I don't think it's desirable to believe, as many people do, particularly on the right in America now, that, as it were, we have no right to feel ourselves in any way able to act in the world. I don't accept that as being the case. I think that the cause of internationalism and the left-right internationalism of the kind that Anne Clwyd and others represented has taken a serious battering of late. But I think that there is also a battering for being an isolationist as well. I think there is a battering for those people who believe that you can effectively let the world govern itself or police itself, or let the UN or other international bodies be the only arbiters. I think that view also takes quite a beating. So it's a constant ebb and flow. That I would say that people just have to be, and I'm certainly more aware myself of the difficulty of navigating between this Scylla and Charybdis.
Douglas, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. This week, the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, Annalisa Dodds, announced Labour's proposed changes to the gender reform legislation. Have they figured out how to manage conflict between transgender rights and women's rights? Telegraph columnist Suzanne Moore joins me on the show. Suzanne, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. So Labour has announced this week that it will be, quote, modernizing, reforming, and simplifying gender recognition law. In practice, this means changing the way doctors grant gender recognition certificates. What do you make of the announcement?
Well, firstly, I think it was a strange way that the announcement came out, which was a kind of, it wasn't announced by Starmer, it was announced in a Guardian article after kind of a way day where they had to think things through. And for such a big change, for such a U-turn, really. I think it should have been Starmer that announced it. I was personally very happy to see the acceptance that sex and gender are two separate things, because that's something that people like me have argued for many, many years. It's the common sense position. But I have a lot of reservations about what Labour actually thinks, given their previous statements.
Do you think it's at all clear yet what the Labour Party thinks? It's become rather infamous that Keir Starmer has struggled in the past to define what a woman is, for example.
No, I don't think it's clear. I think it's not clear, and different parts of the party think different things. And it was only a couple of years ago, wasn't it, that Starmer told Rosie Duffield off for saying that women have a cervix. So now he thinks that women have a cervix and men don't. And now he thinks that, I don't know what the percentage of women he thinks now have a penis or don't, because that's also changed, hasn't it, in the last few years. So I'm not exactly sure where they're going, except clearly they are looking for votes, and they saw what happened in Scotland. And this was not a popular policy, but this policy will continue to be contested in Scotland and in Wales. So Labour are not united on this. I think it's a move in the right direction. But lots of women I know in the party and outside the party feel that we have been trashed. We are owed something of an apology if this is now the policy.
I certainly want to come back to your views more broadly on the topic. Quickly going back to these announcements, as you said, they were revealed through The Guardian, and Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Women and Equality Secretary, was the one putting forward these proposals. She noted that the SNP's proposed changes to gender law, she said, were cavalier, and was trying to draw some distinction between what Labour's trying to do now and what the SNP were trying to do earlier on this year. The policies are different, but do you think the Labour leadership is in any way at risk of making similar mistakes to what the SNP did?
I think we just don't have enough detail. The people who picked it over are looking at what self-ID really means, and this move from having a kind of panel to just one doctor. And I can see already people like Lloyd Russell Moyle saying that that could just be a social worker because they want to keep self-ID, means that some people are still fearful that self-ID comes in through the back door in a way. I think one of the things that should be really made clear about the opposition to self-ID from feminists or people like me is that this has never really been about trans people exactly. It's been about safeguarding women and children. So for me, those are the two priorities, that we safeguard particularly gender non-conforming teenagers, particularly girls, and that we safeguard single-sex spaces. So to safeguard single-sex spaces, we do have to have a clear definition of a biological woman. And I don't think Labour has set I think they're pushing towards it, but I don't know how much they believe it, given so many of the things that they've said, given that they've let somebody like Rosie Duffield be publicly humiliated week by week without stepping in. So I think there's just a lot of distrust. And I think that if Labour want to win back women, they have a lot to prove still on this.
You mentioned some of the other women in the Labour Party that you personally have been speaking to. Have you noticed a divide amongst these women over these proposals?
Yeah, there is a divide in the sense that some people are saying, come on, let's take this as a victory. Let's say we've won the argument and we didn't think we would, and we've moved on in the past few years. That's one position, and that's the optimistic position. And the other one is, let's see the detail of the policy. Let's see how Starmer handles the activists in his own party who are already complaining a lot about this. I think we just need more clarity, and there isn't that much clarity in what has been said yet. But this important distinction between sex and gender identity, that we've been in a position with self-ID and with many of these arguments where this feeling of gender identity, which no one has ever really defined. I mean, it's just a feeling, had to give way to the fact of biological sex. And that was the thing that many of us struggled with, because it was a denial of material reality. And the fact that they now will say, no, these are two different things, that's a step forward. I think most people will see it as a step forward, but to see it as a real step forward, we have to see the meat of it, if you like.
And Suzanne, my last question, you're not on the right of politics. What does the Labour Party need to do to win back support from people like you? And do you think they really intend to do that?
Yeah, Labour would have to do a lot to win back support from people like me, because it's not just individual MPs like Rosie Duffield, it's organisations like the LGB Alliance, Women's Place, Labour's Women's Declaration, people that they've not let go to conference, people that they've expelled from the party, spent their lives working for Labour, and in women's organisations. They have to show that they actually understand what women's concerns have been around this, rather than just pay it kind of some sort of lip service. No, I haven't. I won't be wooed by this. I would like some apologies. I'd like some acknowledgement of why this policy has shifted. I don't want this rewrite of history where things that people said a year ago, 2 years ago, they're now saying the complete opposite. I think, again, that's taking us for granted. And no, they have to do much, much more.
Suzanne, thanks for joining me. And finally, do you want to increase the value of your home while splurging on nice, overpriced lunches? Stay with me now. Rory Sutherland knows what to do. Hi, Rory. Thanks for joining me. So you say in this week's magazine that you've recently found a way to boost the price of your home simply by having nice lunches. Tell our audience your secret.
So, slightly mischievously, I own a small crash pad flat, nothing exotic, in Deal on the Kent coast. And the joke I make to my wife is that the great thing about owning a flat in Deal is you get to eat for free. And let me explain how it works. In about 2011, Deal won the High Street of the Year award from the Daily Telegraph. That was perhaps part of my plan. Actually, Deal is also promoted quite actively by various sort of PR companies, encouraged by local estate agents. But my plan is this, that every time I arrive, I go and walk down the high street and indiscriminately almost buy extremely high quality foods at fairly high prices. And when I get back, I bought some artisan sourdough olive focaccia for $5.45, and I bought a few I don't know what heritage tomatoes are, but strangely coloured tomatoes for £3.50. Maybe something exotic in the seafood line. And I get back and my wife says, well, how much did that all cost you? And I go, absolutely nothing. In fact, we're probably up on the deal. And the way I figure it works is this, that by ensuring the survival of overpriced artisan, slightly gratuitous but high-quality food retailers, okay, what happens is that at the same time as I'm buying that sourdough loaf, there are two people behind me who are an Airbnb couple visiting for the weekend from, say, Fulham, and their natural reaction is, well, I never actually thought of leaving Fulham, but I see you can actually buy overpriced sourdough bread here for over £5 a loaf, so I feel safe. Let's pop next door to the local estate agent and see what's on offer. And so when I say to my wife, I've actually bought the food for free, my logic is that their visit to the estate agent, which is highly triggered by the availability of high-quality restaurants and retailers, will increase the value of my house, or crash pad in this case, by far more than the cost of the food. Now, it's an interesting question because I think it's actually, you'll know this as the economics correspondent, it's effectively a Georgist argument that the value that's actually created in the community is created by the work of people like retailers, shopkeepers and so forth, but the gains disproportionately go to the property owners.
Well, Rory, we'll get into the economics of this in a minute, but first I want to ask, I'm almost afraid to do so. How much do you equate your spending directly to Deal winning High Street of the Year back in 2011?
No, I played only a small part, but, undoubtedly, okay, there is a kind of, there's a tragedy of the commons problem. There's a free rider problem here that I would probably enjoy most of the property gains if I were not to participate and I was simply to go to Aldi instead, okay? But I see it as part of my communal duty within the town to drive up property prices by effectively ensuring that the retail ecosystem of the town is as Fulham-friendly as it possibly can be. And it raises a very interesting question, by the way, because I've always had this hunch. You know how, if a Waitrose opens, basically everybody becomes a little bit richer, okay, as a consequence of being able to say, and there's a Waitrose, okay? I think there's a kind of magical combination of retailers and outlets that effectively gentrifies a place. And it's obviously going to be a mix of independent retailers and, some chains. I didn't manage to save the Marks and Spencers in the town. That closed down. I alone was not capable of keeping that alive. I don't visit quite frequently enough or spend enough. I mean, the whole property market it's not really fair to treat the property market as a market. Because is it consumption or is it investment? It's the only market where people basically spend as much as they can afford, okay? Nobody buys toothpaste like that. Nobody buys cars like that. If we went into a car dealership and said, what's the most I can borrow? I've got a deposit of £50,000. We'd all be driving around in a kind of Bugatti Veyron or an Aston Martin, okay? But the property market, because it's had this reliable history of going up in value, causes people to abandon all sanity. And effectively, the heuristic they use is, how much can I afford to spend on property? I want a property that costs around that. Okay? That, I think, is a disaster because it moves money from the productive economy to effectively the inert economy, and it moves it away from collaborative consumption to rivalrous consumption.
Well, Rory, what I noticed in your piece is that you were fundamentally making a tax point. That perhaps, the UK needs to look a bit more at how it's taxing property, maybe say through a land value tax or something of the sort, because people like you are getting away with free lunches and the rest of it.
I mean, for example, I'm kind of against inheritance tax to an extent, but the extraordinary degree to which inheritance tax is really a tax break on wealth that's been accumulated by doing absolutely nothing is, I think, capitalism to some extent survives on a kind of consensus that it distributes its gains reasonably equitably. And if you have a world where, I've had colleagues older colleagues, typically a bit older than me, who had many years where their house made more money than they did. A colleague who actually owned a house in Brighton and had bought a house in Brighton in the early 80s, for several years in a row, his house actually was getting richer faster than he was, effectively. That's not an equitable system. And so inheritance tax, let's leave that debate, but the extent to which property gains are untaxed effectively just leads to high property prices. And as a result, it's, what we should be doing is subsidizing the artisan bakers and giving them a tax break, because they're creating a lot of positive externalities, and taxing my gains from the property increase. What pisses me off is I bought the place with no intention of making any money. I thought I paid $180,000 for it. I thought I'm at the top of the market here, but I just want a place by the sea. And it's ended up probably making me, £14,000 a year untaxed over the period I've owned it. This is not sensible. I'm paying. I don't know if you're paying me for doing this. You're probably not, you stingy bastards. But if you did pay me £10 for doing this interview about the Spectator's going rate, I'd be taxed on that at 45%. Okay? I think this is just nuts. I'm sorry, I don't understand why a particularly unattractive form of consumption, which is, first of all, the fact that you can live rent-free is effectively untaxed, so you're not taxed on that benefit from owning a property, but also then the capital gains are also untaxed. This is nuts because it means that whether you're rich or poor depends on much more on where your parents lived and whether they chose or were able to buy a house than it does on any particular effort you yourself make. I mean, I have to tragically admit, okay, I get job applications from people, okay, and you see they're applying, they're sending their CV from their parents' house, and it's someplace like Hogsback Road, Beaconsfield, okay, and they're applying to work for me. And I've never done this, but I'm always tempted to email back and say, to be absolutely honest, why don't you just go on a 7-year beach holiday and wait for your parents to die? Because it'll make, that'll make more difference to anything you do in life than actually apply for a bloody job. And I think there's just, I mean, Henry George was right all along. The sooner we admit that, the better.
This is the terrible situation we find ourselves in when it comes to housing in the UK, Rory. You said you don't really call it a housing market, and I agree with you. It's more like a housing cartel. The system is not equitable, as you say. So many people need the bank of mom and dad in order to get on the property ladder. If that isn't accessible to them, they don't get on the property ladder. But the situation that you laid out,
incidentally, we're gonna have a load of media sob stories about people who overborrowed, who now can't afford to pay their mortgage. Okay.
If
those people get bailed out, I'm bloody angry because I always deliberately underborrowed because I can remember interest rates of 10, 12, 13%.
Well,
I've never really had a mortgage that's more than 1.5 times my salary, and I don't see where this is time when I get rewarded for my prudence in my book. Okay.
Well, and to be fair to the government, they have made quite clear so far that they are not going to be subsidizing mortgages in any way. But of course, for most people, the idea of getting a mortgage at 1.5 times their salary is just truly impossible now, given where the housing market has gone.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know. And whose fault was that?
Well, low for long interest rates have proven quite problematic on many fronts. But I guess my last question to you, Rory, is are you concerned that you've given away your secret about free lunches and rising house prices to the masses? Because I'm in Generation Rent. A lot of us don't want to see housing prices go up. We'd like to see them come down.
No. I'll give you another secret, which is very mischievous, okay? If you really want to go onto the rent-seeking world, my brother, who's an astrophysicist, did the maths once, as he would. And he said, if you divide the UK landmass by its population, everybody gets about half an acre each, okay? So for a family of 4, that's 2 acres. There isn't actually a shortage of space in the UK. If you divide the UK coastline by its population, everybody gets 3/4 of an inch. So if you're really looking for scarcity value, it's actually beachfront, seafront and lakefront property that's the scarce commodity, not necessarily property in the middle of a city.
Rory, thanks so much for joining me. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.